To this data workshop. One of the biggest requests that I often get when I do workshops is, are they ever recorded or presented online so that somebody could go back and have a look at some of the content later on? And so what I'm doing here is taking one of the workshops that I often do at the racetrack and turning it into an online video for you to be able to consume. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down, but please write in the comments what you'd like differently so I can do it for you next time or do a better job of representing the data going forward. And so without further ado, here it is. Now, my name, as said, is James Coburn. I've been lucky enough to drive all sorts of different vehicles over the last 10 years or so. Currently, I drive a Formula Ford in the United Kingdom, but I've raced all sorts of different vehicles in different parts of the world, and every single one of these instances that you see on the screen here has used AiM to be able to find improvement in the driving and in my driving in particular. So a lot of the focus of today is my personal experience and how I've used data to be able to interpret the data and how to be able to use it going forward. Chances are many of you are using one of the items on this screen or something similar, and it's designed to be focused on people who use AiM devices. That being said, a lot of the techniques that we'll look at today could be applied to any type of technology that you may have in your vehicle, because the theories and the concepts and the practices which I use can be translated to other types of technology. But for the purposes of today, all of the examples will be using AiM. So a cheesy slide to start off with. This is a video which is about self-reflection. I'm sure you're all groaning at the screen right now, but in many respects this is about looking at your own driving more than anything else, and not necessarily looking at other reasons, other drivers, other variables, although we will touch on that a little bit, with always a focus on looking at yourself. So to start off with, I think the most important thing is to be able to get comfortable with what are you looking at. Now, in each of these examples I will link in the videos that have been prepared online how to be able to access the measures graph and be able to set those up so that you can actually use them. There are how-to videos on all of those as part of my YouTube channel. But at the same time, what I want to be able to have a look at today is, once you've set up your measures graph, what exactly are you looking at? And for me personally, I break it down into three distinct areas focusing on the driver. The first area is looking at time over distance. Now, I find this to be a very easy way of being able to identify exceptionally quickly where time is being gained and lost on track. And in this instance, you can see here, I've identified a scenario at the bottom. This is the first place I look, where the reference line, which is blue just under this box here, is the fast lap, and then the red line that's extending across the screen and gradually increasing in a linear fashion is actually the slower lap. And to be able to identify it and have a look at why that is. So the first thing is, at any chart that I look at, this is the setup that I like to be able to see, which is time over distance. The second thing I like to look at is, well, why is that happening? Why is that time over distance? Why is one lap slower than the other? And the leading indicator of that reason is speed. Arguably, if you're faster or slower at a particular point on track, it's going to be the indicator as to why time is being gained or lost. And so the second area I look at here on any chart is speed. Now, that speed is as a result of many different variables, but the biggest variable that I like to look at for driver development is the driver. And so in a simple scenario here, I'm using GPS longitudinal acceleration, with down being an indication of slowing down and up being an indication of accelerating. I also like to be able to have a look at, well, what's the driver doing in this particular scenario that may be the direct result of why there's a faster trace or a slower trace in a certain point on track. And then piecing those together, you could be able to start identifying what is the driver doing. Now, there's a high probability that there may be other variables that are resulting in the driver performing that particular action. There may be other cars on track. The car may not be handling particularly well. The road conditions may be different. The time of day may be different, and the heat variables changing the surface. It may be a setup variable. But in so many instances, it's very easy to be able to identify using these three models where you actually can potentially find improvement in your driving, which is what we want to be able to have a look at today. Now, for many of you, you may be lucky enough to be able to have more sensors in your cars to be able to use beyond necessarily just the AiM Solo. But the same principle applies, and this is looking at a scenario where in the car I was using here, which was a BMW Spec E46, you can see that there's additional pieces of information on screen, but exactly the same principle applies. The first thing is the time over distance. Where is the time being gained and lost? This is the actual same data as the previous screen, so you can see it's actually a linear progression here. You can see the speed at the very top, which is, well, why is that happening? Well, the car's faster here or it's slower here for a particular reason. But in this instance, what the driver is doing, which is why that speed is there, is broken down into additional variables, which you can see. And here we've got indications of pedal position, which is foot on the accelerator. We've got brake pressure, which is how the brake is being applied, for how long and where it is, and to be able to apply that knowledge to this particular graph. And so it doesn't matter how many or how few variables that you have. This is where I always start when I start looking at my own personal driving, and anyone who asks me, can you have a look at my data, which is often a regular request that I get. You can see here that the focus is first and foremost time over distance, because at the end of the lap you want to be faster than your previous laps, and if you're not, you want to know why. Then you get your speed, and then you get what's the driver doing to be able to do that, and then be able to break that down even further. So to have a look at that in a bit more detail, I've got this chart broken down. I've taken away the measures graph. You may remember in other videos that's as easy as pressing the space bar on your keyboard, and all of a sudden you get a lot more screen real estate to be able to work with. But we'll look at zooming in a little bit more detail, and we're first going to look at this particular area on track. Now this is and we focus most of this seminar or webinar is going to be looking at tracks in America, and this one focuses on Oregon Raceway Park, which is in obviously Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. Now here we can start looking at certain variables. So you can see very much at the bottom straight away, we're in the position where all of a sudden, over the period of this part of the track and time over distance, half a second is lost in these few corners and variables that are here. And so this is the first place that we want to be able to have a look. But oftentimes, being able to drill into that area isn't necessarily as easy, or there's a lot of information crammed in there. So you may have noticed I've got an arrow up here on the right hand side, and there's a plus button. What you can actually do is you can zoom in by clicking on this button on a certain area. And if you did that, now that entire section is now broken down and sort of broken down, I should say, but expanded and opened up into a lot more information. And now we can start looking at certain variables that's happening to the driver. And the key area that I want to have a look at here is the very obvious one right in the middle, which is here, but there are other variables that we could look at on the screen as well as we look through. But this one is a very interesting one to be able to identify as to what's happening. So first and foremost, what we're seeing here is that we are looking at a scenario where this is throttle bits being applied. And as that throttle's being applied on the blue line, which is the faster of the line, it's a very smooth progression out of this particular corner as you come onto this small straight on the track. But interesting, on the red line, there's a huge lift that is here. Now we can look at why that's been caused, and we can actually look at the previous corner, and we can see that the red trace has held the brake a lot longer, and so that transition between brake to throttle is a lot smaller, and so it may have resulted in the car moving around. We can look at that. We may even be able to look at a video, which we'll look at a bit later on. But one of the first things to be able to identify is if we are seeing gain and loss here, and there's a loss in time, one of the indications is, well, why is that? Well, it's because the blue line's faster, because you can see it's faster here, and you can then drill down and be able to say, well, what's happening and why is that the case? And amongst other variables, there's a very interesting area that you can see that there's a big lift there. Now, as we've done that, you've also noticed that there's a second part on this track that we focused on using exactly the same variable, but a slightly different aspect, which is, well, if that's the case, how come here the blue line applies the throttle, has a big sort of a little bit of a lift here and then applies the throttle later, and the red line is a smoother transition? Well, again, if we look at the chart, the first thing we want to be able to have a look at is what's happened. Well, the red line has slowed even further out of that particular corner. and the blue line has obviously gained a lot more speed. As you can see that there's an actual speed advantage that is here through the corner. And at that particular point, you could identify 3 or 4 miles an hour faster. But what's happening here is you can see that if I drill down on that even further, you can see that even though the blue line's throttle application is more gradual in terms of application, the throttle is picked up here, not here. You can see that more speed is carried through the corner, the revs remain higher, whereas the red line applies the throttle later at a lower speed, so the gain is actually still consistent through that particular corner. And this may be due to one of the other aspects that we haven't necessarily focused on here, is that the blue transition on the brake is nice. It's applied and then it's gradually tailed off. Whereas in the red line, the throttle the brake is applied and then it's applied a little bit more and then it's let off, and that may be upsetting the balance of the car and the chassis, and so as a result going back to accelerator maybe later, and it's slowed the car down more and it created a more difficult environment. So it's not always as obvious as a scenario like this, but you can see very straightforward, very clearly in this chart, that the throttle, the time is lost. The reason is there's more speed carried through the corner. And you can see that even though the throttle wasn't applied as cleanly, as smoothly as it may have been done here, you can see that as a result, it's applied sooner, more speed is carried through, and then it's gradually added in more later on. And so interesting to have a look at some of these variables as you think about what's happening on track and what's happening there. What's happening is time is being lost. Why? Is because more speed is gained. Then what is the driver doing to be able to make that happen? And you can see that from these areas. So that's as we start looking at the measures graph. But the first and key area, and everyone wants to be able to assess their driving against other drivers almost immediate. Even in a spec class, we get asked repeatedly, can I compare my driving against somebody else's driving, which we can look at later on. But one of the things that we want to do first and foremost is to be able to identify how you as an individual are driving. Looking for improvements in your own driving first and foremost, and then if you're lucky enough to be able to get the data from one of your competitors, from one of your friends, how do you actually then go about being able to compare that data? So first thing I want to have a look at here is how am I driving? So that's going to be the key focus of this next section. So a lot of information. This is a bit, everyone's like, whoa, there's a lot of data on this particular slide. Or page, I should say, as we look at this. It's on PowerPoint, but it's a page, and this is a rendering of a measures graph. So what I've done here is I've taken the 4 fastest laps from that previous session that I was showing in that other examples earlier on. And what I've done is I've said, okay, well, let's look for areas of consistency and, more importantly, areas of inconsistency. Because if there are areas of inconsistency, then that's an area to be able to clean up. Because if you want to be able to maintain exactly the same lap time or as close as you can get with that consistency through a race, that's what's going to create the opportunity for you to be able to improve your driving and perform better. And so what I've done here is I've taken the 4 fastest laps. The very fastest lap is in blue and the others are in a light grey, which means you can then start looking at, well, what happened on that lap? One of the challenges that we often face is that everyone does 1 lap comparison. But a 1 lap comparison is only useful if you know that that lap was absolutely clear. There was nothing else on the track. There was no slower cars if you're in a mixed class race, or even if you're in a spec race and everyone's the same speed, not everyone drives at the same speed. And so as a result, what we want to be able to do is within the same session be able to identify where there's consistency and inconsistency by having a multiple lap view to be able to remove any of the potential inconsistencies of viewing on a 1 lap basis. And so what we've got here is an overlay of that. And so you can see that all of a sudden, areas where there's a lot of information, a lot of what I learned from Roger Goodell, who does a lot of these AiM videos, they call noise. You can see that that's not consistent. Consistent would mean the line is over the top of the line every single time, which you can actually see here. Nearly every line is almost the same in terms of braking, but throttle application here is all over the place. And so we want to be able to drill into why this is so we can identify what's happening, and then that feedback goes to, if you're lucky enough to have a race engineer, to be able to say, well, let's break down on what's happening. It may be looking at video to be able to say, is it a line improvement? Is it an adjustment in terms of what I need to do as a driver? It may be one of those areas to be able to say, okay, well, let's change the way that the car handles through there to be able to work through it. Or it might be the case of just doing the same action as a driver each time to create the consistency. And how's that happening? So what we're going to have a look at is this area here first of all. This is throttle application coming out of the second corner at Oregon Raceway Park. And so you can see that if we focus on that area there, there's a lot of noise. And then the second area I want to have a look at is later in the lap, a braking application as well. As you can see here, there's a lot of noise that's there as well. So let's do that zoom in again, because this gives us a lot of information. I've just used that plus button to be able to look at this in a little bit more detail. And then the first thing I want to be able to focus on is here. What's happening with this throttle application that on the blue line is faster? So we can see that it's potentially faster on the blue line, because all of a sudden in every instance down here, you can see that speed is starting to deteriorate except for on the blue line, and all these grey lines start to increase. Well, if we look at it, that's because the blue line at the point here may not necessarily be the fastest going in, but it is the fastest coming out. And oftentimes you hear people say, slow in, fast out, or fast in, slow out. This may be one of those particular scenarios. It may also be due to some other reasons as well. So I want to be able to look at those as well. So here, the first reason that we'd be able to identify is, why is there inconsistency in the driving? Again, have that conversation. What's happening? It could be due to the brake trace. The brake trace in the blue line here is actually pretty smooth, whereas in the other lines it's a bit rough. Maybe the chassis is moving around a bit too much, which is preventing a confidence of being able to get to the accelerator at the point where the blue line was able to here. So that's the first thing. There's some cleanup immediately in this particular area that as a driver you want to be able to have a look at and be able to identify why that is. So an interesting first area. Also notice here that the blue line has a very smooth, consistent trail off, whereas some of the grey lines slightly less, slightly a bit more hesitant coming off the accelerator there as well. So it could be just a better brake here and then coming out of the corner, whereas these are slightly less of a brake application, maybe trying to roll speed through the corner, which is evident here, but at the same time it's causing just some issue here in terms of getting on the accelerator and going out. So this might be a case of get the car stopped, get it turned, get it going again, rather than trying to roll speed and being hesitant on the throttle. That's not necessarily a huge time loss gain, and the reason being is that obviously another corner coming up very soon. But what I wanted to have a look at next is this particular area here, because this is where something does make a difference. Because if you notice on the grey lines, all of a sudden this is a tiny impact in terms of speed distance, but this area here has a huge variable, and some of these grey lines are going up to 0.3 of a second slower coming out of that particular corner, going all the way down the straight. And so, interestingly, the first area to be able to have a look at here is, I would say, what's happening? Well, losing time. The second thing is why? Well, the blue line's carrying a bit more speed through that particular corner that is there. And so let's look at the driver inputs that are here. So the first thing is there's a relatively smooth, not perfect, consistent application of throttle coming out of that corner, but it is relatively linear in terms of progression. Then if we look at those grey lines, there's a zigzag here where it's up and then it's down and then it's up again in some of these instances. And so in that particular area, we may be saying, okay, well, the throttle's on, then the throttle's off again. And if the throttle's on and the throttle's off again, then every time the throttle's off, it's not accelerating, it's starting to potentially slow. So then let's have a look at why that is. And it may be to do with the brake trace that is here. And so this brake trace is earlier, it's more consistent, where all of these are sort of brake, ease off, maybe brake a little bit more and then tail off. And so it may have, especially this one here, it may have something to do with the application of brake as you come onto the corner that's arguably overslowing the car a little bit, and then the car is then trying to turn and transition. The driver here is saying, oh, I need to get on the accelerator sooner, hitting the throttle when the car's not settled and taking a set, and so as a result potentially having to lift off the throttle again because the car's not behaving as it needs to. To be able to further validate this, we could look at steering position. We could look at some of the latitudinal GPS as well if we wanted to dig deeper. But it's still an indicator of a potential reason why there's too much happening in there if it's not smooth to be able to have that acceleration. And the other big aspect here is that we've all probably learned from the very beginning of racing that the corner you really want to get right is the one that leads on to a long straightaway, which is what you can see here. And so not only is more speed being carried through the corner, but you can see the blue line is the top of all of those lines coming out of the corner, and you see that translates into speed and time as it goes down the straightaway. So that's a really important aspect to have a look at as we look at, and this is your own driving. This is 3 sessions. The fastest was 3/10 faster than the others. But every single lap you do a 2-lap race and you're 3/10 slower, all of a sudden the distance you may have to a competitor who may be behind you or ahead of you may be due to the fact you can't replicate the speed every single time. And I think many of us have done the, wow, that's a great lap, can't replicate it. And oftentimes it's not due to variables on the car starting to diminish, or it may be. It may be due to the way that the driver is driving through the corner and starts to overdrive or to really try hard, and it slows everything down. The next area to have a look at here is another area of inconsistency and noise, is in this part of the corner here. And you can see that, again, there are some areas here where the speed continues to deteriorate coming out of this particular area. See, one of the grey lines loses a lot of time that's through here. Some consistently lose a bit of time, some are okay. Well, if we look at it again, the same scenario is happening. Whereas you're finding that on the braking, the blue line is actually braking a little bit sooner, a little bit harder than over some of the laps, and then accelerating sooner coming out of the corner. And we can see that here. We can see that there's a really good brake trace, and the idea is you want, and so just to have a quick sort of check on brake traces, the idea being is that you really apply 10/10 at the beginning, the threshold braking conversation that you had when you were at racing school and been practicing, and then you slowly tail off the brake until you get to the point where you've released it, and that's a gradual release of the brake as you drive. However, if you don't do that, there's a lot of inconsistency that's here, and so you can see that smooth brake application and release allowed the blue line's throttle to be able to apply a lot sooner, and so as a result was able to shoot out of that corner, and it had a potential impact in terms of coming out of that corner. Same scenario you can see as it applies to throttle as well. These are inconsistent, which means it's been very difficult in that transition to be able to get the throttle to 100% throttle again. And if we look at this particular chart in this area, I focused on just a couple of pieces, but there's so much to be able to look at here, so much potential cleanup to be able to work through. But it's definitely a very good illustrative example of how driver inputs are resulting in time, distance, and loss of time, which is actually indicative of the speed trace in key areas. And this one, especially this top arrow here, indicative of more speed being carried down a long straightaway, which in some instances carried a 0.3 of a second slower, and then that speed trace actually grew to maybe even 0.4, which can oftentimes be the difference between 1st and 10th place on a highly competitive grid. So moving on, the way that we look at this on the chart oftentimes is frustrating for people. They look at bars and graphs and charts and see bars and graphs and charts. They don't see a story, they don't see the reason why. And so what I wanted to be able to do as well is to be able to demonstrate that there are other ways with technology to be able to apply. So if I go backwards one, if you think about what we have here, we have speed, we have RPMs, we have throttle, and we have brake. If we go to this view here, we have speed, we have RPMs, we have throttle, and we have brake. And one of the things that I often do as a reference, something that I personally really enjoy, is being able to see how smooth and clean a lap can be as I want to be able to get time out of a particular corner. And so what I'm going to do is show a transition of corners, one left-hand corner, and then a transition through a complex of corners to be able to see. And what I want you to be able to do here is to be able to watch the throttle trace. Because in this particular model, you're going to be able to see some slight variances as to how the throttle applies. The first corner is actually quite a smooth transition. Then we go through the complex, it's not, and to be able to spot that. So as you can see through that particular scenario, what was actually happening as we went through this transition is the slight dab of throttle as coming through this particular corner was upsetting the car to the point where it felt like couldn't go flat through that last corner to come up the hill. And not only is this a straightaway, but the other thing which is particularly important at this track is that this straightaway is a really a steep incline as you go up a hill, which means that the moment you lift off the throttle, if you were stationary, the car would start to roll backwards. And so it adds further pressure in terms of being able to create and keep, I should say, consistent throttle as you go through. So many people like the fact that not only do we see it in the graphs, but if you want to go back to having a look at what's happening on screen, by being able to apply the same measures over the top of a video, allows you to be able to look at that in slightly different types of scenarios. So that's a key component to be able to have a look at. Other aspects of working with the data is oftentimes car positioning. Now we've gone through the scenario that says number 1, time distance. Am I gaining or losing time? Number 2 is why is that? Because there's speed coming through the corner. But then the third aspect is what's the driver doing to be able to do that? And sometimes it can be associated with position on track. And so what I've done here is I've created a GPS map. You can do this in the AiM software, and again there's a video that's available if you want to be able to learn how to do this. And the same scenario applies, which is we have the grey are there's 4 laps on here, the grey are the 3 slightly slower, and the blue is the faster of the laps. And what I've done is I've overlaid them on the map here to be able to identify, are there differences that are happening as the driver's on track, to be able to say the driver, I talk about myself in the third person, this is me, what I'm doing on the track here to be able to move forward. So a couple areas to focus on here in terms of inconsistencies. There are other. The first is this particular corner here, which is uphill, and you can see that there's a wild variation in going through that particular corner there. And then the second is this very slow left-hander in the middle of the track here. There's also some inconsistency with some wide angle there as well. So in looking at it, the question is why would the blue line potentially be faster than anything else? Well, the interesting variable here, which many people don't necessarily appreciate when they look at it just here, is that if you're looking straight ahead here, you can't see anything because this is the top of a hill. So all you can see is very far in the distance, some sky, some clouds, and some trees in the distance. And it's hard to know where the track goes when you land. And so that may change the confidence that the driver has as they go through this particular corner. Whereas if your line is in the right position, it gives you more confidence potentially that you're actually going to be able to make it through the other side of the hill without necessarily driving off the track. And so, there are some key aspects of this. Now, while I'm showing you this, there's no real reference for you to be able to see that. But if you're at the track and you know that particular stretch of road, now you can start pinning it together. And that might be a simple case of your reference points. Looking ahead, I'll go back to driving school again, the eyes up sort of concept, which is where am I looking as I come through that transition to be able to make sure that I'm in the right place on the track. Because not only am I necessarily, I could be full throttle through all of these areas, which is likely happening, but the blue line is driving a less distance, which means that arguably at full throttle, going uphill, driving slightly less of a distance, increases the speed potential because you're driving less road. So that's an interesting look. But what we can also do, if some people are like, well, okay, well, how about this one here? What's going on here? Am I hitting apex? Am I missing apex? Well, one of the things you can also do is you can actually take the same GPS data and overlay it on Google Maps, or Google Earth, I should say. And so again, there's a video to be able to show you how to do this as well. But now this starts to get into the point where you can start seeing the position of the same laps, but on the track, being able to identify how well I'm doing against apex. Now, some people have said, well, what's the GPS accuracy? And that's a very fair, valid point. However, if you're measuring laps from the same session, chances are everything's consistent in terms of how the data's been captured. So you can see variances on your lap, even if there's a slight inaccuracy in terms of the GPS overlay on the Google Earth. But I would argue, looking at this, it's not particularly bad in terms of accuracy, but you can also see here, the first thing was looking at that line coming over the top of the hill, driving less distance, smoothing out the straightaway. There's a lot more road being driven here. That may be part of the variable. And then the second thing is if we zoom in on this particular area here, we can see that there may be less, there's a smoother transition through that corner by really coming down to apex and then being able to drive the car out, whereas there's a lot of variation in terms of how extra road is being driven through this very slow corner here, where the car generally tends to bog down quite a lot. And so a lot of ways of being able to look at the driver input. Once you started to be able to identify, maybe those are the corners or maybe those are the areas that I really need to be able to develop. So a very interesting and fun way of being able to look at the data and be able to start analysing and understanding what you're doing. Now the last piece is we genuinely find scenarios whereby, well, every lap that I do, I'm better at this part of the lap than that part of the lap. How do I, what would happen if I drove every single section of the track perfectly? Or I should say perfectly to the ability that I have as a driver. Now, one of the challenges that we have in this scenario is that typically when you use these software, they break the track into left-hand turns, right-hand turns, and straights, which results in a split time analysis. And this is a split time analysis that we have here. This results, or split report, this results in having 15 different segments to be able to work through. Now, if any of us are comfortable with watching professional motorsports like Formula One, typically the track is broken down into 3 segments. And when you hear the engineer on the radio with the driver, they're saying you're losing 3/10 in sector 3. And then they break that conversation down into a little bit more detail. Interesting thing is with AiM, very few people use this feature, but you can actually do this with the software itself. And so again, there is a video showing people how to be able to create this, but you can create the same track but with different sectors to be able to then start identifying which sector is actually costing you the most in terms of gain and loss of speed. And then you can then build it out. And so what we've got here is I've broken the track down into 5 different sectors that are here. And then what you can do is you can expand it to be able to say, okay, so the red bar is the smallest on each of the laps. You can see that because it highlights the fastest time you had through that particular sector. And so you can see here that on my fastest lap, I had 3 of the 5 to generate a 1 minute 53.3. But interestingly, if I pieced together the best of the 3 laps, the 5 sectors, I could have managed a 1 minute 53.0. But knowing, of course, that these are all sectors that I could control, and even 5 might be overly generous, but you can see here that sector 1 would be able to say, okay, so how much speed am I carrying through this particular area? And then you can then drill down and be able to say, well, where am I losing speed against that? And you can see this sector here, sector 3. So if we think about sector here, 1, 2, 3, I'm losing 0.1 here over my fastest lap as I go through. Well, okay, well, let's look at the consistency through there and be able to identify what can I do differently as I go through this particular area. And interestingly enough, the sector 2, which is this area which I actually showed on the video, was actually the fastest on the fastest lap. And so you can see that's 0, and every other lap is a little bit slower, but there are variances. That's 0.1 slower, that's 0.2 slower, that's 0.4 slower. So that's an area saying, okay, how do I get consistency there? But then here, what did I do on lap 7, which I could potentially replicate because it's 1/10 of a second slower than my actual fastest lap, which would allow me to contribute to getting to that faster lap time. It just breaks it down into an area where you can start looking at your own driving and be able to say, are there things that I can do? And this just gives you a quick reference to be able to say, if you did that sector better, every time it's worth 0.2 of a second every time you do it. And that makes a huge difference as you start developing, because 0.2 every single time is a second every 5 laps. So that's looking at your own driving. But then there is oftentimes the opportunity in terms of saying, how are they driving? And looking for improvements in your driving versus another driver. Now, there's many, many ways of being able to do this, but I personally think one of the best ways to do this is to do an endurance race together. Because if you do something like the 25 Hours of Thunder Hill or a 24-hour chump race, or any kind of endurance race that may exist from a professional point of view, like the Creventic series, all the way through to a Lucky Dog race in the Pacific Northwest, you have the opportunity of being able to compare yourself against other drivers without any of the other potential variables that exist, such as car, such as the other drivers, components on that car, the state of their tires. Now, in an endurance race, granted, things change over time. tires wear out, for example, the track differs, but it's a lot easier to be able to understand how drivers are working with each other and be able to see improvement. So this is an example at the 25 Hours of Thunder Hill where I was racing with a good friend of mine, and there was one particular point on track, and I don't think it's going to take many of you a little bit of time to be able to spot it, but we'll go through the method anyway to be able to say this is what's happening. So if we look at this, if we look at what's happening in terms of time distance, this was the fastest lap, and up till this point, a bit of inconsistency here and there, maybe a little bit of speed advantage here, like, hey, everything's great. But you get to this corner, which happens to be corner turn number 9 at Thunder Hill, and all of a sudden, disproportionately slower. Just a massive sort of bump that exists here. And so then we go up and see, well, why is that happening? And actually here you can see that I've got the cursor over that particular point, and you can see at that corner, the friend of mine who's driving the same car as me is doing nearly 10 miles an hour faster through that particular corner. And so if you think about it, we need to then start breaking down as to why. We can see here that there's less brake being applied, and the brake, and then the throttle is being applied sooner. Over braking here on my part, because I'm the blue here, and there's a lot that's going on, and then that's resulting in that difference. Now, if you're in an endurance race, that from there to there, if we look at that, is about a second. Now let's say you do 60 laps in a stint. You've put your team down 1 minute in an endurance race from one corner alone. And so it's really important when you look at the data to be able to say, if I do anything working with you, how do we address this particular segment here, and how do we improve it? And this is where you sit down with each other and be able to say, look, we're in the same vehicle. What's happening here? Now, it turns out that turn 9 is one of those corners that everyone knows. As you go, it's a crest of a hill. And then on the other side, not only does it go down, but it goes down to the right, which is, in the car's the wrong place. You could find yourself driving off quite comfortably, or quite easily, I should say. Comfortably is the wrong word. And if that's the case, then there's an element of a fear factor that's there that potentially has the impact of being able to go over there. So then it's a conversation. How are you positioning the car on track? How are you having that that thought process there? So it's really important to have a look at, that sort of aspect, to be able to say, hey, we're in the same car, on the same team. And if I go out and do 60 laps, I put us a minute down. So I want to be able to know how that is, and fix it before you get out there. So that's a really good way of sort of comparing data. The next thing to have a look at is the old phrase, wow, they're really good at driving in a straight line, which is oftentimes used in reference to the fact that you think somebody's got a far bigger engine than you have, and then clearly you're at a disadvantage. One of the things that I learned very quickly, looking at data, is gear changes make a significant difference in terms of your ability to be able to maintain speed. The slower your gear change, the slower your potential opportunity will be to be able to maintain speed down a straightaway, or keep the engine in its particular rev band, and so where optimum peak power is being generated. So here's a great example, again, racing against a friend of mine, different cars this time, but one of the things that we can see is that first and foremost, they're just braver going through a corner than I am, and this is giving them half a second advantage in one corner. That's the conversation. It was my first year driving Formula Ford, so I was huge, like a sponge, just trying to learn what they're doing differently to me, to be able to understand the car and everything. And that was just a wonderful conversation to be having, conversation to be able to have in terms of development. But then we have these particular areas here, which, as we look at it, there's an element of, well, hold on a second, we're okay here, but all of a sudden, the blue line goes far, and the time distance is lost, and we're at the same here, but all of a sudden this blue line starts to tail this red line. But then if we look at where the gear changes are happening for the red car, it's happening here for the red line, and here for the blue line, here for the red car, here for the blue line. And so talking about a scenario whereby these gear changes may be slightly different. This might be just slightly a hair's breadth slower on a gear change, but it's the position on track where that gear change is happening, maybe having a significant impact in terms of the speed that can be gained down a straightaway, which in this instance you can see is quite a notable difference as you get to this particular point in terms of speed. So again, that old adage, oh, they're really good at changing gear in a straight line, they're really good in a straight line, has a lot to do with their ability to be able to change gear quickly, efficiently, or even just in the right place that is there. So it's a really important thing to have a look at as well, which is simple inputs. And this This I often refer to as free time. It's like free money, because it doesn't necessarily warrant any additional skill or bravery in a corner or positioning. It really just results in you being able to change gear faster. Now, there may be a hesitance and a fear factor of zinging the motor because you put it in second instead of fourth. Always a potential factor that is there. But as you get more confident in those gear changes, this has a potential impact of being able to make free gains without necessarily saying we need you to be braver, more confident, learn the car and develop. This is just learning your own skill and development in the vehicle itself. The second thing to have a look at would potentially be what's happening with the car itself, and are there things we can change in relation to gear changes and gearing. So again, having a Formula Ford, this is something that we've been working on. Having different gearing in the car may change the way that the engine behaves, and so you may find that there's slightly different opportunities for advancement. Sorry, got a bit blanked there. So interestingly here, see there's speed gain at the end of each of these straightaways here. There's one here where the gap's like 6 miles an hour. There's one here, and there's one here. This one's particularly interesting because the red line slows, but then, and loses time, but then gains time back by rolling more speed through that corner. But at this particular point, just loses a lot of speed going down the straightaway that is here. So I wanted to have a look at some of these in more detail. So what I did was I added an RPM trace to the vehicle I was in, and if I zoom in, you can see that this is the RPM trace. Now, if you talk to race engineers and teams working Formula Ford, the general feedback that I've heard is that anything over 6,800 RPM, the engine's making nothing but noise and potentially putting a lot of strain on the engine itself. So if we're going down the straightaway and I draw a 6,800 RPM line, if you look at where this line starts to really expand, it starts there and it finishes about there. But if you also look, it also coincides with any of the rev band being over a 6,800 RPM threshold. So if the engine's making no power at that point, just potentially putting strain on the engine and making a lot more noise, then potentially this has the opportunity of being able to change the variables that exists in terms of the other engine. Now, I don't have the RPMs of the other car, it wasn't mine, but still what we can do here is we can start saying, let's actually have a look at this and be able to say, how do I maybe change the gearing so that I've got a longer fourth gear so I can keep those revs down, so I can potentially stay in the power band on the longer straightaways to be able to potentially minimize the distance that grows in terms of speed gain on a straightaway. So these are all areas of experimentation and being able to have a look at this data. Nothing that I've shown today is necessarily concrete. This is just how I oftentimes interpret the data to be able to identify where I believe I can improve or are the things that I can control going forward. And I think that's a really key component in any data sort of analysis, which is how do you get comfortable with being able to see the data how you need it? Would it be using the video? Would it be using graphs? Would it be through conversation with other drivers? This just gives you the reason why you would have that conversation. This just starts that dialogue off. And so what I wanted to do is finish off this quick webinar by being able to give you a little bit of information that's available. The AiM Technologies website is more focused on, it feels like global and European focused, but at the same time covers everywhere and links through to different aspects of the world. The AiM Sportsline videos prepared by Roger Goodell are super. They're on YouTube. Under AiM Data, I've created a series of instructional videos as well that you can see the link that is here, and a group on Facebook that is growing rapidly that has every person who loves the data, instructor, from new entrants to new owners of the technology. There's a brilliant Facebook group that you can join where you can just ask any question, and chances are you'll have about 10 answers, hopefully all relatively consistent, in a matter of minutes. And so there's some really helpful resources. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your time. And if you've got any questions or comments, please write below. If there's things you want to learn about, please comment. If there's something that you haven't liked, please let me know, because we can adjust. And as we go through the next period of time, if there's anything you want to learn more about in video format, just let me know. So thank you very much.